Today we're going to complete the forwarding of our laced-on boards binding by attaching the boards, lining the spine, and a few other things like capping the book so that it's ready for covering with leather. Last week we left off having trimmed the boards to the correct size. The next step is to lace on the boards. We'll start by marking on the front and the rear of the boards the location of the holes for the lacing. So I'll draw a line 8 millimeters from the edge of the board. It could be 10 millimeters on the front or the outside of the boards, and on the inside of the boards I'll draw a line twice that distance, either 16 or 20 millimeters from the edge. We then position the boards very carefully so the squares are even head and tail, and then we mark the position of the slips, and then using a square we run that across to the 8 millimeter line. And we do that for the front and back boards. Now we're going to punch holes from the outside at these locations with a heavy-duty awl. Now you need a piece of wood or something like that to punch into, and you need a heavy-duty awl. I got this awl from Hewitt's, and I'll put a link to the exact awl in the description. Now I want a hole that's just big enough to push the slips through, but not too large. Now once we have the outside holes, we're going to do inside holes. And they're going to be at 45 degrees from the outside holes. So we can just judge that by eye. It doesn't have to be exact. Again, we want to make the holes large enough to get the slips through, but not too large. The second hole is towards the tail, below the first hole. Now we're going to cut little V-shaped grooves that the slips are going to sit in so that they're flush with the surface of the board. If you've never done this before, you should practice this on some scrap board, and you should work out what your favorite knife is for making these grooves. You can even put one of the slips in the groove to see whether it's deep enough. Last week I had a very good question about making holes, and my response was that it's generally better to punch holes so that you're not removing material. And then, especially in this case, we're going to close these holes back up. So the material is still there. So sawing in sewing locations on the spine of a book, if you're doing tapes, for instance, instead of recessed cords, you're removing material that you don't necessarily have to. Sometimes it's an aesthetic decision. An example is the Coptic sewn journals, where people will put little eyelets for holes in the boards. And that's fine, but in this case we don't want noticeable big holes. So we just put the board in place and just test that the slips sit in these grooves nicely. Once we're happy with everything, then we can work paste into the slips and then lace them through the boards. So we push them through from the front and then back from the inside. Once I've worked paste into these slips, I'll just trim them off a little bit with scissors to make them easier to lace, and so I'm not dealing with such unnecessarily long piece of cord or the slips. I'm only working the paste into the slips up to about 8mm or 10mm away from the spine, because I don't want to paste the slips into the grooves yet. I want the boards to be able to move up and down. If the holes have closed up and you're having trouble getting the slips through the holes, then a smaller awl can open the hole back up. I'm just adding a little bit of adhesive or paste at the holes here. I'm not putting it on the slips. Remember, I'm trying to keep the slips in the grooves dry. Now I'm going to draw the slips tight, but then I'm going to pull the board away from the shoulder about 1/2 millimeter. I just want to be able to see down between the edge of the board and the shoulder. When we cover the book in leather, the leather's going to try and pull the boards back towards the spine, and we want to keep a very small groove open. Now we're going to hammer the holes closed. Until recently I used to use a piece of melamine to do this, but then I got this nice big chunk of steel, which is really good. Now I'm going to drop the book down so that the board's horizontal, and then I'll hammer closed the outside holes, or the holes towards the foredge. Then I'll turn the book over and then hammer closed the holes that came from the outside, so the excess material had been pushed to the inside of the book. Of course, you want to be very careful not to pinch the slips and cut them off between the hammer and whatever the plate is that you're using to hammer against. The round domed face of the backing hammer is perfect for this. Then we do the other board. Now to go back to the little gap between the boards and the shoulder, we're going to make a little tool, a piece of card or hooked card that we're going to use later to keep that small gap between the shoulder and the board open. But there is another common method of keeping that gap, which I've never used, but it's a really good idea, and it's something I should experiment with. It's very common to tip a piece of thread, heavy thread or light cord, just onto the edge of the board and use that to keep that gap open. I think the only thing to remember with that trick is to remember to remove it later. Now we can trim off the ends of the slips with an extremely sharp knife. Just be very careful not to cut the slips back at the edge of the boards. There's some exposed wet cord on the inside of the boards now, and now is one of the steps when the waste sheet would have been protecting the text block. Of course, I forgot to put the waste sheet on my end papers, but I'm going to give this a good nip now, and I'm going to put my pressing tins on the inside. If you don't have pressing tins, just put a moisture barrier such as a sheet of polyethylene on the inside, and just give that a good nip, and that'll help close up the lacing holes. You might notice that my pressing boards are different here. The bottom one is coated in polyurethane, and the other one is plain wood. The coated polyurethane one is nice. If you get a bit of adhesive on it, you can wipe it off easily, but it doesn't absorb moisture. So in this application, having the plain wood board is nice because it absorbs the moisture out of the boards. Now, in preparation for sewing the end bands, I'm going to line the spine. I'm going to use a material called Fraynot, which is just a light cotton material, so you don't necessarily have to have the expensive Fraynot, just use a light cotton. And it's just a matter of cutting it to the correct size. It can be longer than the text block, but just the right width, bone it down well, and then trim off the ends. I'm just going to back corner the boards at this point. I like to do it now so that before the headbands get in the way. Now the back corner helps with the formation of the head caps and stops that sharp corner poking through the leather. Now there's different styles of back corners. For this late 19th century type of style binding, typically it goes down the spine a bit further than it extends out towards the foredge. And so it's just taking a slither of material off at an angle, which is hard to describe, and hopefully you can see it in the video easier. I put the tin in so that I don't cut into the text block. I'll trim the Fraynot liner, and then I'm going to completely skip sewing the end bands because I use this book in the video on sewing the end bands. So just up in the right top corner there should be an eye showing up linking to that video. So there's our end bands done. So now it's time to line the spine. I'll start by lining the spine with a softer paper to help smooth out the bumps such as the tie downs from the end bands. I'll extend this lining up over the end bands and trim it off later, and this will just help support the end bands. I'll use a bone folder and rubbing down paper to rub this lining down really well to try and smooth out the bumps due to the thread. I'll sort of force those threads into the paper. But if there was still noticeable bumps, I may sand it, and I may even do another layer of paper. So this binding is a hollow back binding, and we're going to produce the hollow back by attaching a tube. I'm going to use a heavy acid-free craft paper, and I'm going to do a 1 on, 2 off hollow. So I'll measure it to the width of the text block. I'll crease it against the text block, and then I'll fold this over twice. You really want this to fit well, so I'm going to double check the measurements. You don't want it extending past the shoulders, and you don't want it too narrow. A technique that I like and learned from Nick Colishaw's DVDs on leather bookbinding is to leave the excess material attached to the tube and then to slit that off after it's been attached to the spine of the book. So I'm just making sure that I'm putting the single layer down on the spine, so it's 1 on, 2 off. The only thing I'll caution about this technique of removing this excess material is you don't want to cut your slips. I'll put a link in the description to Nick's DVD, which is a Society of Bookbinders DVD. He has a series of videos that are all excellent. And if you're interested in cloth rebacking, which is something that I'll probably never cover, he has a really good DVD on that. Now we'll trim off the tube at the head and tail, being very careful not to cut our end bands. Now that we're getting very close to covering the book in leather, we want to protect the text block even more than with our imaginary waste sheet. So we're going to cap up the book. To do that, we need to open it up. So we want to open the book like it's a brand new book. Go through and open it gradually from the outside. And then we'll put in 2 sheets of paper into the center of the book and then fold these around the text block. So we'll just cut little tongues at the front that we can fold around to protect the foredge. These don't have to be perfect, just enough to protect the text block, and look, there's a waste sheet. I tipped an imaginary waste sheet on so I can rip it off later. You do want to crease the paper well over the outside edges of the text block, because you do need to be able to see where the squares, or need to be able to see where the edge of the text block is to get the squares adjusted right. Now the text block is protected, we can do a bit of light sanding. I'm not trying to round anything over, I'm just taking off the very sharp edge. I'm definitely not rounding the corners like I might do on a library binding or a springback binding. Now I'm going to make the tool to maintain that little gap between the shoulder and the boards. I'm using 0.3mm manila card. I'm doubling it up so that it's 0.6mm thick. I was after about a 0.5 millimeter gap, so 0.6 is close enough. I'm just going to fold that up one board thickness, so about 3mm. I'll just fold up a 3mm bit of that double layer card, and that will slip into the book behind the board and hold that gap open. If there's any roughness where the slips are laced in, that can be sanded off. And you can even put a thin layer of paper over the slips if you want. We're not going to do that. So the next step is to set the squares. So we're going to paste down the slips. So we'll put some paste on the slips in the grooves, and then we'll adjust the boards so that the squares are even, and then we'll let the slips dry in place. We're getting towards the end of this video, and before we get there I just want to stress that this is my approach to forwarding a laced on boards leather binding. It's based very much on the English tradition. I've already mentioned the 4 books that I'm heavily influenced by, and most recently Nick Colishaw's DVDs, but other people such as my original teacher June McNichol as well, who was trained in an English style as well. So everyone will develop their own approach over time. So the more you do this type of binding, the more it will become your style as well. Though everything I've shown I've learned from someone else. I've not developed any of this myself. So before we let the slips dry, we'll just make sure that the squares are nice and even and the boards are in their final positions. And now I think about it, if you were going to put a thin layer of paper over the laced in slips, you would do it now after you'd set the squares. So the final thing we'll do before covering the book is to slit the hollow. So we'll just open the book up and slit down either side of the hollow about 20mm, and this allows us to turn in the leather later, because we're going to turn the leather down into that hollow. We've reached the point where we're ready to cover the book with leather, so that's the end of the video. I hope you're enjoying this project. As always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button, and if you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button. I hope everyone's staying safe, and until next time, cheerio.